Two Worlds, One Family by Dragon Translator. Chapter 35. To the Cove. Hiccup stopped just outside of his house. A small crowd formed around Hookfang, who stood in the middle of the stone circle of the plaza. Snotlout hurried down the steps, calling for Hiccup and Astrid and the others to follow. Hiccup shared a glance with Astrid. She shrugged but took his left hand and walked beside him. Stormfly, who had waited outside, moved to Astrid's left side. Toothless walked on Hiccup's right side. Sharpshot, feeling better after lying down for a bit, rode upon Hiccup's back, head peeking over Hiccup's right shoulder. The crowd parted as they passed. Just as they reached the front, Hiccup's eyes widened. A teenage girl with black hair laid unconscious upon Hookfang's back. Snotlout had her wedged between the spikes on either side of Hookfang's spine. A net woven around the spikes kept the girl from falling off. Snotlout climbed onto Hookfang and untied the net. Gida walked over. Snotlout handed the teenager down to her. She stepped back and Snotlout climbed down. "Hooky and I went flying. We saw a boat pushing onto the beach at the bottom of one of the sea stacks out east. She was laying on the boat like this." Hiccup looked around. Flemmer stood next to her empty cart at the bottom of the Great Hall stairs. "Flemmer!" Hiccup called. "Can we borrow your cart?" "Aye, Chief." The woman pushed the cart through the opening the crowd formed for her. Gida laid the teen in the cart. Hiccup looked at Astrid, then glanced up the mountain. Astrid grinned, squeezing his hand, and mounted Stormfly. Stormfly bowed to Hiccup. Another opening allowed Astrid and Stormfly to move out of the circle. Once free of the people and dragons, Stormfly flared her wings and rose. Hiccup watched until they landed on Gothi's extended walkway. "Chief!" It took a moment before Hiccup remembered he was acting chief. He looked down. Flemmer grinned at him and gestured to the cart. "I'll take her to my farm. Gothi can look her over better in a bed than this." Hiccup nodded. "I'll bring Gothi over when Astrid and Stormfly return." He looked behind him. "Ruff, will you go with Flemmer and help her?" "Sure, boss man," Ruff said. Flemmer began pushing the cart out of the village. Ruff walked with her. Tuff and Barf and Belch walking behind them. Hiccup turned to Snotlout. "Was there anything else in the boat with her?" he asked. Snotlout shook his head. "She has a horn carved from a walrus tusk tied to her, but nothing else except her clothing. Nothing we can use to find what tribe she's from." Hiccup looked over to Gida as the people slowly returned to their jobs since the excitement was over. The mage stared after Flemmer. Hiccup walked around. Gida's brow was furrowed, and she looked as if she had seen something that unsettled her. Hiccup frowned. His gaze shifted. Those with the cart reached the bridge that connected Burke with the sea stack Flemmer's farm resided upon. Hiccup turned back to Gida. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Gida blinked and her face cleared. She faced Hiccup, then looked out towards the ocean. She said nothing, only shook her head. Shadowfire, standing nearby, moved closer and lowered his head until he was in his mother's line of sight. She stared at him. Shadowfire tilted his head so he could stare at his mother. He chittered something that did not sound like the old tongue the dragons used. Gida sighed. She looked to Snotlout. "Did you see any other ship or boat?" she asked. Snotlout frowned, then shook his head. "I didn't even see hers at first. Hookfang pointed it out to me when we banked around a different sea stack." Gida turned to Hookfang, but the dragon shook his head. Gida grunted. Before Hiccup could question her actions, Stormfly landed, and Astrid aided Gothi down. "Flemmer took the girl to her farm," Hiccup said when Astrid looked around and then at him. "She thought it easier for Gothi to check on her while the girl was lying on a bed, as opposed to the cart. Gothi, if you want, you can ride on Toothless." Gothi nodded. Hiccup aided her onto Toothless's back. He then climbed on. Sharpshot crawled around, laying in the saddle in front of Hiccup to allow Gothi to grip Hiccup's tunic. Astrid, Gida and Snotlout mounted their dragons. Soon all three were in the air and headed for Flemmer's farm. Hiccup's eyes narrowed as he read the runes Gothi etched into the dirt. He heard Astrid hiss and look over. Her hands were fists, and she glared out towards the water. Hiccup reached over, placing a hand on her right wrist. She stared at him. Hiccup felt the arm he held relax. Her fingers entwined with his, but the other hand remained a fist. Hiccup did not blame her. Gothi believed the girl had been given something to render her unconscious, and the elder was not sure how long it would take for the teen to awaken. "Flemmer," Hiccup began, only to have the woman hold up a hand. "She not be leaving here, Chief. I'll send for Gothi and ye as soon as she awakes." Hiccup nodded, though an idea ran through his mind. He turned to step away, but Astrid did not move. He paused, facing her. She stared at the hut, as if she could see through it. Hiccup frowned and stepped closer. "Come with me to the cove," he whispered in her ear. Astrid jerked and stared at him. She nodded, releasing his hand, and moved to mount Stormfly. Hiccup walked over, climbing onto Toothless's back. "Snot," he said. "Go back to the village and tell Gobber I'll be back in a few moments." "Sure, Hiccup." Snotlout mounted Hookfang. Hookfang bowed to Hiccup, then flared his wings and rose into the air. Hiccup looked at the twins. "Guys, can you go and find the Terror Elder and as many terrors as you can, and ask them to meet me in the cove?" "Sure," Tuff said. Barf and Belch bowed to Hiccup. The twins mounted their chosen heads. The dragon took off, banking around and heading inland. Hiccup turned to Gita. "Will you take Gothi back to our hut?" Gita tipped her head, gesturing to Shadowfire. The dragon lowered until his belly lay fully upon the ground. She then aided Gothi into Shadowfire's saddle. "Elder, please sit here," Gita said, pointing to a spot just behind some handles Hiccup had installed into Shadowfire's saddle. "And hold those. It would be safer than riding behind me and gripping my robe." Gothi nodded. Gita climbed on behind the woman. Hiccup held up a hand. Shadowfire stared at him and did not rise. "Gita, meet us in the cove later." Gita snickered, eyebrow lifted. Hiccup saw Gothi smirk and Flemmer grin. Hiccup grunted and rolled his eyes. "I need to speak to Astrid alone," he said, only to have the three adults giggle and the dragons chortle. Hiccup sighed. "And I need to speak with you, Gita. So when you drop Gothi off, will you meet us in the cove?" "Sure, Hiccup," Gita said. Shadowfire rose to his full height, which placed his riders above where Stormfly held her riders. Hiccup saw Gothi's eyes widen and her hands grip the handle she held tighter. Gita murmured something Hiccup did not hear, but it served to relax the elder. Shadowfire carefully bowed to Hiccup before moving to the edge of the sea stack. He slipped off the edge. He rose and headed for Gothi's hut. Hiccup turned to Flemmer. "Thank you," he said. Flemmer nodded. "The lass can stay with me till we find out what's up, Chief." Hiccup nodded and climbed onto Toothless's back. Toothless and Stormfly bounced into the sky. They banged east and headed for Raven's Point. As soon as they landed in the cove, all the dragons, even Sharpshot, moved to lay in the shade of a fir tree, far enough that they could watch their humans, but give them a form of privacy. Hiccup led Astrid to the very boulder she sat upon while waiting for him the night she learned of Toothless. "Please sit," Hiccup whispered. Astrid did, but said nothing. Hiccup sat down beside her. He reached over, grabbing her right hand. He pulled it into his lap, and began rubbing it just like she had for him earlier. Astrid hummed. "I can see why Dad likes this," she whispered. Hiccup smiled. "Are you okay?" "No. That girl is our age, Hiccup. And someone harmed her, and until she wakes and tells us who, I can't hit them with my axe." Hiccup continued to rub her hand. She hummed again. He smiled, letting her hand go. "Take your spaulders off." Astrid looked at him, eyebrow raised. She snorted. Soon her metal shoulder guards rested upon the rock next to her. Hiccup gestured. She smirked, but spun so her back faced him. He reached up, moving her braid over her shoulder. He then began kneading her shoulders and neck, just as she had his. Her chin fell and she moaned. Hiccup smiled, realizing why she was adamant about doing this for him. Hearing her enjoy his attempt to relax her made his heart beat faster, and pride well within him. This time no door opened to let in an outspoken blacksmith. This time as Astrid slumped, boneless, Hiccup caught her and pulled her back against his chest. She pillowed her head upon his shoulder, and he enclosed her in his arms. "Thank you," she whispered. "No, thank you. You showed me how to do this, after all." Astrid hummed. The sound echoed through Hiccup's chest. "When I lift my arms again, I'll finish rubbing your shoulders." Hiccup chuckled. He nuzzled against her hair, then placed a soft kiss upon her cheek. "We'll find out what happened to that girl," he whispered. "You'll get to swing your axe. I promise." "You do know the way to my heart." Silence fell. Hiccup relished in the fact he could hold Astrid like this. He had often dreamed of doing something similar after he turned 13. Each dream left him bitter and depressed the next day, but that was the past. "Astrid," Hiccup whispered. "Hmm?" He knew many would believe he would have hesitations about things in their courtship, given his past. Well, that was true to a point. He understood courting couples could do some things people who remained just as friends would not. Even with all he endured, he knew he was permitted to do those allowed actions. However, he would ensure one thing was known to Astrid. "If I ever do anything in our courtship you don't want me to do, don't hesitate to let me know." Astrid sat up so that she could stare at him. She leaned close and pressed her lips to his. Hiccup returned the kiss. Several heartbeats later she pulled back. "I trust you, Hiccup," she whispered. Hiccup smiled. "Still, tell me. Please." Astrid sighed, then smiled. "Sure, Hiccup. The same goes for you. Let me know if something I do hurts you or upsets you. I'll listen." "I know." Astrid caressed his cheek, then moved back to her previous spot. Hiccup shifted so that his legs bracketed hers. She laid her arms over his as they enclosed her waist. Her head pillowed on his left shoulder again. A gentle pair of lips pressed a tender kiss to the side of his neck. Hiccup nuzzled her hair. Silence fell once more. Oh, to have Bucket here. End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that one. I like that one, but can I just say something? I am very 50-50 about Heather. I know why she does things, but you don't get in the way of Hickstred without my hatred. I'm just going to say it. Sorry if you can hear anything in the background. Something's really not behaving for me right now. Come on, get in there. Working on a hairstyle and you kind of have to curl it the night before. Anyway, yeah, that's just nice. Hiccup's returning the favour, that curled up in the cove. Oh, and that was Gita at the end. Anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment and subscribe and hit that bell to get notified whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye my guys, gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Take care.